Okay, so while Sam Houston, with the bulk of the Texas Army, is east of San Antonio, uh, somewhere between San Antonio and Houston, trying frantically to train his militia. There's still that garrison of about 350 to 400 Texas revolutionaries in Goliad. And you might remember the reason that they're in Goliad is that they were the remnants of the Matamoros expedition, that crazy expedition that after the capture of San Antonio in December of 1835, the Texas Army started marching to to Matamoros, and Houston has to go down there and beg the army to stop. It's at that point he sends Jim Bowie back to San Antonio to evacuate San Antonio, which Jim Bowie doesn't do. Houston takes most of the Texas Army back with him into the East Texas area, but he does leave a significant garrison under the command of Fannin in Goliad, somewhere between 350 and 400 men. So that's what those folks are doing there. Those soldiers are doing there. And Goliad, of course, is La Bahia, which we've talked about. It's one of the three, which is now it's Goliad, which is one of the three communities of Spanish Texas that still exist today. The other two being, of course, San Antonio and Nacogdoches. So Fannin, there's a big statue of Fannin at Goliad. By the way, if you go down there, Goliad's a really cool place. They've rebuilt the mission church there. Some of the original Presidio was there. They did a very, very faithful rebuilding of the mission church. It's quite beautiful. There's a big statue of Fannin there. There's something really cool about the Goliad Victoria area. But anyway, so Fannin, the commander of the Texas troops, he just doesn't know what the heck he's doing. He's not a professional soldier at all, and he's very hesitant. And a good example of this is, remember I had talked about how Juan Seguin, the reason he survives the Alamo is he slips out of the Alamo. He's asked by Travis to slip out of the Alamo and go down to Goliad and talk to Fannin and persuade Fannin to take those 350 troops and help reinforce the Alamo. Um, well, Fannin, he doesn't really know what to do. He starts marching towards San Antonio, and then he decides, no, I'm not going to do this. I can't be of any help. And so he goes back into Goliad. So he's of no help to Travis or the Texas revolutionaries in the Alamo, and he's just not very aggressive. His soldiers are they're there. There's quite a few of them, but they're not being utilized or deployed in any effective way. And then what happens is that a disaster occurs to Fannin. And the disaster comes in the shape of General Urea, and I'll spell his name in my outline. It's Urrea. General Urea came up through Matamoros with about 900 Mexican soldiers. Remember, Santa Anna had marched through central Mexico, through San Luis Potosi, Saltillo, Monterrey, then across Eagle Pass, and then into San Antonio. Well, General Urea comes up a different route. He comes up through Matamoros, and La Bahia, Goliad, is within his sights. And what he does is he fights a couple of battles, but long story short, uh, Fannin is so ineffective, he takes his army out to meet General Urea's forces, and it's a indecisive battle in the sense that Fannin never is able to really mount much of a defense of Goliad, and then ultimately he surrenders Goliad. So General Urea, and Pena talks about this, he is by far the most effective Mexican general in Texas. Santa Anna was horrible. Filasola, who Pena talks about, who he really hates, was ineffective. But General Urea did a pretty good job, and he won the biggest victory of the Mexican army in the Texas Revolution, which was the capture of Goliad. So at that point, things get very, very ugly for the Texans. They just assume that the Mexican army is going to treat them as prisoners of war, let them march out of Goliad, and probably sail on to New Orleans, which would have been the logical place for prisoners of war to be sent to. But they don't reckon with Santa Anna's desire to kill everyone that is facing him. And when Santa Anna finds out that Goliad has been captured, but the soldiers are still alive, he is furious. He wants them dead. He sees them as land pirates. He wants to have a mass execution. He wants to send a message to the Texas revolutionaries that if they will fight the Mexican army, they will have to pay the maximum price. So General Urrea at this point was out of Goliad. He's not involved with this, and the Mexican officers that were in Goliad, uh, they kind of get Santa Anna's order, and finally they decide to obey it. So on Palm Sunday, just on March 27th, about 3 weeks after the fall of the Alamo, um, Fanna's men, who had been captured about a week before, they were told to gather up their things. They were sure that they were going to go and sail to New Orleans, so they were in a pretty good mood. They were happy and singing. And what they didn't know is that the Mexican officers on the spot had decided to obey Santa Anna's army and to execute the men. And so what happens, the men get up early in the morning on Palm Sunday. They march out of Goliad. There were 3 roads going out of Goliad, so they're kind of broken up into separate groups, probably so they couldn't resist. They march out of Goliad, feeling pretty good about things, feeling pretty lucky, thinking that they're on their way back to the United States. And what happens is, instead, Mexican soldiers lining the road start shooting, and we have the massacre of Goliad. And this is what Ehrenberg talks about. Apparently, he claimed that he survived that massacre by by playing dead. And much of what we know about what happened at Goliad comes from his account, because the Mexican soldiers were quite successful in executing almost every Texas revolutionary soldier that they had captured. Then after the really, you can call it a murder at this point, the murder of the captured soldiers, the Mexican soldiers came and killed the physicians that were caring for the wounded men. And then apparently Colonel Fannin, the commander of the Goliad, who had been so completely inept, he was the last person that was executed. So he got to witness the horror and see the consequences of his very, very poor leadership. Once again, it's important to note that Pena de la Pena in his diary talks about how shocked and sickened many Mexican soldiers were by this atrocity. De la Pena calls it a cold-blooded murder. De la Pena doesn't pull any punches, cold-blooded murder. And really, much more so than the Alamo. The Alamo was a battle, and so during a battle, certainly folks are going to get killed. But there was nothing there was no battle with Goliad. It was the execution of soldiers that a week previously had surrendered to the Mexican army. And he admired General Urrea. He was quite relieved that General Urrea was not part of this mass execution. It's unclear if General Urrea would have obeyed Santa Anna's army, but we'll never know, because General Urrea at this point had gone north and was chasing some Texas soldiers, so he wasn't there on the spot. And the bodies of the victims of Goliad were buried. So Goliad, it's an atrocity, a war atrocity, and it's going to have immense consequences in the sense that remember Crisp, his whole argument is that racism between Tejanos and Anglos didn't cause the Texas Revolution. It was a consequence of the Texas Revolution. And after 1836, when Anglos win the Texas Revolution, they use the Alamo to kind of beat up, metaphorically and sometimes physically, Tejanos in Texas, saying to them, "Well, look, you're part of a group of people that were part of this massacre at Goliad." And so what happened is many Anglos who were already racist and Americans coming into Texas, what happens at Goliad and the Alamo, it fuels their racism, and it justifies, at least in their eyes, the racism that the vast majority of Anglos felt towards people of Mexican descent. So Goliad, not only is it a horrific event, a war crime, a mass murder, the consequences of Goliad for the Mexican American community in Texas would be horrific, and to some extent last until this very day. And once again, this is an example of you may not care about history, but history cares about you. This is one of many, many, many examples of that being true.